Morning, good evening, and good afternoon. Let me first take a few moments for some of the folks to join. And this live show will be recorded for anyone who wishes to join and learn about the broader US Bangladesh relationship. Good morning, John.
Good morning. How are you doing?
Uh, I'm doing all right. How about yourself?
Good, good. It looks like it's nighttime, and I have
Yeah.
Christmas lights behind me. But
Yeah.
that's a photo from a recent visit I had to visit family in Northern Virginia. So if I
I see.
move,
Oh,
you can see the Washington Masonic Memorial behind me. So we're all very much in the Christmas spirit these days.
so speaking of Christmas, have your grandkids arrived yet?
Yeah, so unfortunately, like many families, mine is spread out over the holidays, but we've concentrated in Massachusetts and the Washington, D.C. area. So part of the family and at least half of the grandchildren will be here in Massachusetts, and the rest will be in Northern Virginia. And hopefully, I'll get a chance to see them after the holidays. So thanks.
I see. Okay, so it looks like that some of the folks have joined. Today, this is a informal live discussion where I intend to talk about one of the most evolving and challenging foreign relations the United States face in South Asia, namely the US Bangladesh relationship. From security cooperation to economic development cooperation, from counterterrorism to people ties, the US Bangladesh relationship historically has faced challenges, but also it has risen to occasions and grabbed opportunities wherever it could. Today, in this growing and like rising geopolitical tensions in South Asia, Bangladesh find itself in a hot environment where the geopolitics is changing rapidly. So to make sense all of this, today I am thrilled to be joined by experienced and seasoned former U.S. Department of State Senior Foreign Service Officer, John F. Daniel Witch. Welcome, John.
Great, thank you.
John has served, I think, on two occasions or three occasions in Bangladesh at the U.S. Embassy, Dhaka, and then he has served also at the U.S. Consulate in Peshawar. He was a faculty member at Naval War College. He was a diplomat in residence in the United States. So he has vast experiences, I think more than 32 years of experiences working in the State Department and decades of experiences engaging the civil societies, different political leadership, and institutions in South Asia. So John brings a rare insider perspective. It is really good to have you, John. And so let's start with the big picture. US Bangladesh relations don't often get the attention they deserve in global media. From your experience, how do you describe the foundation of this relationship and what do you see as the most pressing challenges currently facing the US Bangladesh relationship? To
Sure.
you,
So
John.
thanks. Sure. Thanks for the question, and thanks for inviting me here to discuss these important issues. So first and foremost, I'm a retired U.S. diplomat. I retired from the State Department 4 years ago. So my views are my own. I don't speak for or on behalf of the U.S. government. But for 32 years, I did represent the United States government at home and abroad in Bangladesh, Pakistan, in parts of Africa, the Western Hemisphere, the United States. And the U.S. Bangladesh relationship was a central thread throughout my career. I started in Dhaka in 1990. I worked on Bangladesh in the mid to late 1990s in Washington, and then spent another 5 years in the 2000s in Dhaka. Um, and I always start talking about U.S. Bangladesh relations by admitting the obvious that the United States was on the wrong side in 1971 for reasons that had to do with geopolitics and U.S. interests at the time. In 1971, the United States did not support the birth of an independent Bangladesh. Um, I'm pleased that some of my colleagues, former colleagues at the U.S. consulate in Dhaka, saw the mistakes that the United States were making and dissented formally with U.S. policy. Archer K. Blood and his colleagues in Washington and Dhaka deserve great credit for telling the truth, speaking truth to power about what was happening in Bangladesh at the time. But I'm also pleased that
We intervene here as someone from Bangladeshi descent. I voiced my concern in this live discussion about the U.S. role in 1971, and I believe that the United States should clear its position about the 1971.
Yeah. But again, on that, the US is, I mean, I've said this on multiple occasions. Many other US diplomats have said this. Archer K. Blood has been honored in Dhaka and elsewhere. So everyone on the US side acknowledges the mistake the United States made in 1971. But for me, what's important is that since 1971, the United States' interests and role in Bangladesh have been remarkably consistent. We've been a partner in Bangladesh's development. We've developed ties from people to people, business ties, governmental ties. We've supported development. We've been consistently supporting democracy in Bangladesh, even at various times when Bangladesh was not under a democratic government. We've had a strong security partnership. So the U.S. interests and role in Bangladesh have not changed remarkably over the years. And I think one of the characteristics that helped the U.S. and Bangladesh relationship was the bipartisan consensus within the United States, whether they were Democratic administrations or Republicans or Democratic, leadership in the Congress or Republican leadership. Everyone supported these broad goals. Now, obviously, U.S. Engagement around the world is different these days during the Trump administration. It's much more of a transactional relationship. President Trump has focused on a policy of America first. So when it comes to the US Bangladesh relationship, many of the characteristics of the relationship haven't changed, but the way we talk about them are different. So, for example, there's still a strong economic relationship, but it's more focused on, I think, equity in the relationship, not just the fact that the U.S. is a large market for Bangladeshi exports, but how can U.S. companies export more to Bangladesh? How can
Right.
Americans invest in Bangladesh? Bangladeshis invest in the United States. The security partnership has continued. U.S. support for democracy has continued. So the way we talk about things is different, but the fundamentals change. Probably the biggest change in U.S. Bangladesh relations has been the role of development assistance. The U.S. Agency for International Development no longer exists. That was a decision of the Trump administration. I'm glad that certain U.S. humanitarian assistance, particularly, continues to flow to Bangladesh, albeit at reduced levels. The U.S. continues to be the largest supporter of many international organizations that are active in Bangladesh, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, various UN agencies. So the visible presence of U.S. development assistance has not been the same. But I think the generosity of the American people and the interests of America in Bangladesh's development continues, even if there have been changes in the Trump administration.
Thank you, John. So you have talked about economics and economical ties. So let's talk about economics. The U.S. is one of Bangladesh's largest export destinations, especially for garments. Yet, trade relations haven't always been smooth. There had been roughness here and there. How would you assess this side of the relationship? And where are, like in the economic sectors, where are areas that this relationship can improve?
Sure. So again, I had the opportunity to sit both in Washington and Dhaka and to be inside government and outside government. So from a Bangladeshi perspective, clearly the United States has been an important market for Bangladeshi exports. And the growth of Bangladesh's garment industry over the decades has played an important role in helping to stimulate Bangladesh's economic development, the empowerment of women, and has helped to transform Bangladesh. So it's been a good thing. So as an American diplomat or as an American who's interested in Bangladesh's development, I can see the positive role that the garment industry has played. At the same time, as an American, as a consumer, I might benefit from less expensive garments from Bangladesh. I didn't check the labels on what I'm wearing, but I would bet you that one piece of clothing that I'm wearing was made
It's
in
made in
Bangladesh.
Bangladesh. Right.
As a consumer, I'm happy that Bangladesh and other countries provide garments. But at the same time, I recognize that economic dislocation has hurt American workers. I mean, there is not really an American textile industry anymore. In other areas as well, the U.S. economy has become less competitive, and jobs that had existed in the United States that help to families to grow and to help develop areas of the country, those jobs have left. Now, those are global changes. It's not just about US Bangladesh relations, but I think this is why or how you can understand the shift in the Trump administration. And I think ultimately it's a good shift for everybody, is that we're open and honest about our interests. So Bangladesh wants to continue to export garments and other things to the United States. Bangladesh wants Bangladeshi citizens to be able to come to the United States to get jobs, to send back remittances. That helps Bangladesh and arguably helps the United States. At the same time, America wants to be able to compete on a level playing field, whether it's selling agricultural commodities, as you well know, selling Boeing aircraft, selling other material. And for US investors who are in Bangladesh, we want American investors to be treated fairly. We don't want American investors to have to compete against other countries' investors who are willing and able to pay bribes to get contracts. We don't want American companies to be unfairly treated when it comes to taxation or make it overly difficult for them to remit their profits. So I think a relationship, an economic relationship that is more beneficial to both countries is ultimately more sustainable. And I think to the credit of the current government of Bangladesh, they early on understood this change. And the efforts of the Bangladeshi government and private sector to negotiate with the Trump administration on a trade agreement, I think were successful in large part because Bangladesh understood before many what had changed in Washington and what Bangladesh needed to change. So for that reason, U.S. exports to Bangladesh are increasing. And as an American citizen, that's to me a good thing.
Yeah, so as an American citizen, this is also to me a good thing, okay? But in a discussion on negotiation, as you have mentioned previously about equity, right? So equity, like equal benefit, mutual benefit should have the priority. So when you talk about the Boeing aircraft order, as somebody from the aviation professional, what it seems to me is that that decision was kind of rushed, and the decision was not made in consultation with the industry experts. And I don't know, how do you view that? Like, in the face of threat from another country, is it okay for a country to take any decision without examining or analyzing the broader consequences? Because they have ordered 25 wide bodies aircraft, but as an aviation professional and studying aviation material, it appears to me that it was not a right decision, and it may be because it was a like they rushed to make that decision. So how do you view that?
Yeah. So I'm obviously not familiar with the specifics, and I'm not an aviation expert as you are. But I can say a couple things. So from a Trump administration standpoint, they looked at the overall trade balance and they saw a significant deficit. So if you look at the two economies and you look at areas where Bangladesh could increase its imports from the United States, one obvious area was agricultural commodities, and they've done that. Another sector was the energy sector, and you've seen increases in LNG imports. But the aviation sector is another big one. So, the merits on whether or not Bangladesh needs additional aircraft, if so, what type, et cetera. I mean, those are complicated issues. My understanding is that the negotiations to finalize an agreement are still underway. So, in some ways, Bangladesh didn't promise, and again, this isn't unique to Bangladesh. You've seen a similar phenomenon
Right.
with other trade negotiations, that it's more to me a declaration of intent that
Right.
Bangladesh will give preference to purchasing US aircraft, if and when those aircraft will be purchased. And I think there was a number that was put out there which was based on something but may not end up being the final number. So as an American, and when I was a diplomat, I would advocate on behalf of US companies. I obviously hoped that the US companies would be successful. I realized in some areas US companies were not competitive, but I think in the global aviation world, again, there's really only two major options, right? There's
Yeah,
Airbus
no, no,
or
no. My
Boeing.
concern is not about US companies, because I would say the US company in aviation is the best in the world. Okay.
Right.
I understand it and I accept it. But my concern was that the decision was rushed on Bangladesh's end. And when a
Yeah.
decision is rushed, I don't know how sustainable it can become in the long run.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. No,
yeah.
those are fair points. And again, there was a certain urgency to reaching the agreement, as the clock was ticking on the U.S. Tariffs. And there certainly needs to be a lot of thought within Bangladesh, not just about which aircraft to purchase, but there's bigger issues regarding the viability of Bangladesh Biman, how it should be managed, how it should be structured. I look at other airlines, and again, I don't want to get too far down this field, but I know it's your area of interest as well. I traveled to Bangladesh twice this year on Turkish Airlines, and I never traveled on Turkish Airlines before. But
How was the
Turkey,
experience?
yeah, it was great. And Turkey has obviously made a strategic decision to invest in Turkish Airlines, to invest in airport infrastructure, to use Turkey not just as a destination but as a transit point, as other Middle Eastern countries have done, as Qatar has done, as the UAE, and others. So maybe there's a future for Bangladesh in playing a broader role. I mean, with so many Bangladeshi expatriate workers around the world, there's obviously a lot of demand. So I don't want to sidetrack us, but I guess my point is that I think it's an important issue for this government and any government to look at. And when it comes to decisions on procurement, I do hope and expect that US companies will be able to compete fairly, whatever Bangladesh ends up ultimately deciding to do.
Okay, John, now let's widen the lens. Bangladesh now finds itself in the middle of a broader Indo-Pacific geopolitics. There are superpowers from here and they are trying to compete in the backyard of Bangladesh. How does that affect the US Bangladesh relationship? And what is your thought in this so that the US Bangladesh relationship may not suffer from this rising geopolitical tension?
Yeah. So again, this is a whole, larger topic. One which I've thought a lot about, both as a diplomat, as a academic during my time at the U.S. Naval War College, and since I've retired. So the first thing I would say is that in the global system, it's not unique to have rising and falling powers. I mean, the world has seen this before. In fact, the last big transition was from the British Empire to the American Empire, if it were. And that took place over much of the 20th century. And it was a peaceful um, process of transition. And the US and Great Britain are probably the two closest allies in the world. So the fact that one country is a rising power and another is a declining power doesn't necessarily mean that they have to have conflict. At the same time, the world didn't manage the rise of Germany well, which led to two world wars. So it is probably the most important geopolitical issue of our day, how the world reacts to a rising China. And each US administration has taken a somewhat different approach. Many people have been surprised by the Trump administration's approach. They had assumed that it would be one much more of conflict, where the Trump administration seems to look at the China relationship as more of one of competition, certainly economic competition, and in some areas, strategic competition. But there's also opportunities for collaboration, cooperation. So I was recently in Pakistan, and this issue was very salient there as well, because obviously Pakistan has a close relationship with China. Pakistan is building a closer relationship with the US and the Trump administration. And the best explanation I heard from somebody who talked about this is that the US and China can pursue parallel lines when it comes to Pakistan. They don't have to cooperate and work together, but they also don't have to be in conflict. And in some ways, the US and China have similar interests in Pakistan. Both countries want to see Pakistan deal with its economic challenges. Both see Pakistan playing an important security role, and they see other benefits to that relationship. So, again, when it comes to Pakistan, the US and China don't have to compete, they can in some ways cooperate. I think there's a similar dynamic at play when it comes to Bangladesh. Bangladesh, no matter which government is in power, can't ignore China. I mean, China is an important factor. It's an important economic factor. It's an important geopolitical factor. Um, but I don't think Bangladesh has to choose whether it will cooperate with China or whether it will cooperate with the United States. There will obviously be some areas in which Bangladesh will have to make choices. But in the security area, for example, the Bangladesh military continues to receive a lot of its equipment from China for obvious reasons, including economic reasons. At the same time, Bangladesh continues to be an important U.S. security partner in the Indo-Pacific. And one of the things I've been happiest about over the last year and a half is that the strong relationship between the U.S. and Bangladesh militaries has continued. And just recently, there was a senior U.S. military delegation in Dhaka for the annual talks between our two countries on security issues. So the U.S. and China will continue to compete. They'll compete in the Indo-Pacific region. They'll compete to some extent in Bangladesh. But I think that competition can be managed in such a way that it doesn't have to lead to conflict.
So, speaking of security, you have talked about security and U.S. role in the security in South Asia. So, in Bangladesh, in recent days, we have seen a rise of extremism, religious extremism, and in during previous time in the last 15-20 years, Bangladesh has been a great partner of the U.S. in counterterrorism. For example, to as an American, let me talk about Ovijit Roy, an American Bangladeshi blogger who was brutally hacked to death sometime in 2015, simply because he has a different way of thoughts, different way of expressing himself. One of the alleged perpetrators, was Major Saeed Jia. The US Department of State 4 years ago, on December 20th, offered $5 million rewards for the capture or for any other information that will help lead to his capture. However, after 4 years, in recent days, what we have seen is that there is possibilities of this alleged killer having an acquittal, and this coincides with the other extremist elements being released from prison. So how do you see this? How do you see this affecting the US Bangladesh relationship? Because these folks are not only a threat for Bangladesh, they are a threat for regional security and in turn global security.
Yeah. So if I look at my career, obviously the terrible attacks of September 11th, 2001 changed how the U.S. saw issues of terrorism on a global basis. And much of U.S. policy over the subsequent decades was directly related to this. When it comes to Bangladesh, counterterrorism cooperation has been a central theme of U.S. relationships with all governments, with the BNP government from 2001 to 2006, with the caretaker government from 2007 to 2008, with the Awami League government from 2008 to 2024, and with the interim government from 2024 until present. So security cooperation, counterterrorism cooperation has continued throughout this period. At the same time, there have been terrorist threats in Bangladesh in each of these eras. And we can talk about terrorist incidents during the BNP period. We can talk about terrorist incidents during the caretaker period. We can talk about terrorist incidents during the Awami League period. And we can talk about terrorist incidents during the interim government period. So I would first disagree with your premise that the situation regarding Islamic extremism or terrorism has gotten worse over the last 18 months. I have seen no evidence of that. Certainly, the world has changed in terms of the amount
So,
of.
so
Let me, if you let me finish talking, okay? So the awareness of what's happening in Bangladesh may be more now because of the prevalence of social media. So in 2001 to 2006, or in 2008 to 2024, the situation was different. So again, there may be, not just in Bangladesh, but in other countries, certain incidents get more attention globally because of the prevalence of social media. But if you look at the actual numbers, I don't think you can conclude that the Islamic extremism has become worse during this period. Nor would I say that U.S. cooperation on counterterrorism issues has suffered during the current period because of the factors that you mentioned. And, you know, I take issues related to terrorism in Bangladesh very seriously and very personally. Zulhas Manan, one of my colleagues at the U.S. Embassy in Dhaka, was the victim of a brutal terrorist attack. My children attended the American International School of Dhaka, and some of the victims of the Holy Artisan Bakery attack were close friends of my children and close friends of my family. So anyone who makes an accusation, and I'm not saying you are, but those who call me a jihadi or who accuse me of being somehow soft on terrorism are deeply insulting to me and to the memory of those who, I cared for who were lost in terrorist attacks. But at the same time, I'm not going to exaggerate a terrorist threat just because it may be politically in vogue, whether it be in the United States or elsewhere. So, I try very hard to be an unbiased analyst of events in Bangladesh. If I thought Bangladesh was becoming a terrorist safe haven, I would say so. I would be critical of the government, but I just don't see that. So there
But
are
like,
terrorist issues, there are terrorist concerns, but I think a characterization that somehow the situation is worse now than before, I just don't think is accurate.
no, I mean, talking about votes or however the situation is like, my specific concern is on this specific individual, Said Jia, who is alleged to be a murderer of Ovijid, and he is now in Bangladeshi media openly talking, and there is a possibility that he may be acquitted. And as an American, I voice my concern on that. And the Bangladesh government should do better and think better about that, because like the US has offered a $5 million reward. I don't know what is going on about that reward now.
Yeah.
Anyway, now let's talk
Yeah, no,
about.
let me just say one other thing on this because I think this is important for those watching as well. I have the unique perspective perhaps of having worked inside the US government and having worked outside the US government looking at the same issues. So what I can say is that when it comes to issues related to terrorism and when it comes to cooperation, much of what happens between two governments is not made public. So neither you nor I know at all what conversations are going on between the United States and Bangladesh about terrorism, about the specific issues or individuals that you mentioned. We don't know what the government of Bangladesh is planning, what they are doing, what the United States is asking them or expecting them to do. So we can judge governments by their public statements. And we can judge them by their actions. But what we don't know is the ongoing diplomatic and security and law enforcement cooperation that happens between the two countries. So I'm not prepared at this point to be critical of either the United States government or the Bangladesh government because of how these specific cases have been handled. Let's let them play out and let's see what happens.
Right. Okay. Now let's talk about people-to-people connections, because like at the beginning, you have mentioned about 1971 and the U.S. role in 1971, but American people were against injustice. We have seen concert of American musicians for Bangladesh. We have seen American people support for Bangladesh. So people-to-people connection is equally important, if not more, than the government-to-government connections. Right now, what do you think about the people-to-people connection? Because we have been seeing a rising trend of visa denials for Bangladeshi individual in some countries of the world. Okay, and we have been seeing U.S. government's tougher role on immigration. How do you see this affecting the people-to-people connection between the U.S. and Bangladesh? Do you see that there may be more visa denials? And what advices do you have for Bangladeshi students who want to pursue higher education in the United States? How should they act on their social media? Because social media uses is also becoming an important deciding factor in visas. So, what is your
Sure.
advice for the younger folks?
Yep. So the first thing I would say is that I totally agree with you that people to people contacts are very important and are a critical part of diplomacy. And the US, has invested a lot in public diplomacy. We've invested a lot in people to people ties over the years. We've had a number of programs, exchange programs, supporting activities within Bangladesh. And certainly we've been pleased to see the increasing number of Bangladeshis traveling to the US, increasing numbers of students, increasing vibrancy and size and influence of the Bangladeshi American community. For obvious reasons, the Trump administration has taken a different approach to immigration. They've taken a different approach to a number of programs of public exchanges, and it is what it is. There are still opportunities there, but the rules are different, and they seem to be changing every day. So my advice to any Bangladeshi who would like to visit the United States, whether it be for studying or for other purposes, is that they pay close attention to these changes. And what they should know is that immigration is determined by law and by executive policy of the administration. So the individual consular officers have some discretion, but they also have to act within what the law allows them and what direction they're receiving from Washington. So there are a lot of misperceptions about visas and visa decisions. Unfortunately, there are people who have abused the U.S. immigration system, and they make it more difficult for those who follow the rules. So that's an unfortunate reality. And some similar issues are playing out in other countries. One other thing that I'd say about visas, which is important, is that people to people exchanges is a two-way street. And one of the things that I again applaud the current interim government for is facilitating visas for Americans and others who want to travel to Bangladesh. And what I say to every American or other foreigner who has questions about Bangladesh or who I think might have a misperception, I tell them to go and see for themselves, because a certain image will get portrayed in the media or in social media, and then that doesn't conform to reality. So for me, the opportunity to visit twice in this year was a real eye opener for me. And I think, particularly in categories which at times have been seen as sensitive, journalists, researchers, NGO officials. In past periods, it's been difficult for these people to get visas to visit Bangladesh. And as a result, the real story of Bangladesh doesn't get told, and those misperceptions persist. So, again, I think it's a two-way street. I think more Americans going to Bangladesh is a good thing. More Bangladeshis coming to the United States is a good thing. Both countries are sovereign countries and will make their decisions on visa policies. But there are opportunities, I think, to expand these ties. And I think the Bangladeshi American diaspora community has a critically important role to play, both in helping to build the bridges between our two countries and to help explain to their fellow Americans or others in the United States about Bangladesh. I mean, every American diplomat I know who has served in Bangladesh has left with a lifelong affection for the country and its people, because the people of Bangladesh have been so warm and generous, and have opened their hearts and their homes to all of us. And I'm sure the same thing happens in neighborhoods around the United States as Bangladeshis or people of Bangladeshi origin meet their American neighbors who have never been to Bangladesh. So again, it takes patience, it takes time. One challenge, though, I think we all face is the social media environment. And, I've spent a lot of time looking at issues related to India, US India relations, and India Bangladesh relations. And I have to say that many Indians who operate online aren't the best ambassadors for their country. And, some of the issues which we've seen in the United States related to immigration, H-1B issues, et cetera, have been exacerbated on both sides by both Americans and Indians with some of the toxic rhetoric that takes place and the insults and the memes and, all of that. I see, unfortunately, some of that slipping into the discourse about Bangladesh as well. And that people in the US and otherwise, they take their political differences in Bangladesh and personalize it. So again, I'm sure there are people who would even be critical of you and me having this conversation. Most people don't know.
Maybe.
We've known each other for a number of years. We might
Right.
have some different views, but
Mhm.
that doesn't keep us from having a civil conversation. I wish
Right.
more of this could happen, frankly.
Yeah. So like we are nearing the end. I have a couple more questions very briefly. So since we are talking diplomacy, do you think for a bilateral relationship for both Bangladesh and the US, the bilateral relationships should be more based on the countries, not on person, whoever is in charge of government? The policymakers, should they be careful about not having the personal grudge or personal favoritism affect the broader bilateral relationship?
Yeah, and yeah. So in an ideal world, sure, absolutely. In the real world, though, personalities always come into play. People tend to over personalize things. I think what some people mistake and misunderstand, particularly when it comes to the US, is they believe that every US official who speaks about an issue is putting forward their personal opinion. Again, I'm a retired diplomat. I can tell you my personal opinion. But if you were, Peter Haas or Dan
Correct.
Mozina or Marcia Bernicat or Howard Schaefer or Jim Moriarty or Bill Milam or any other person who was serving as a U.S. ambassador, they were representing the views of the United States government, not their personal views. So I think people do tend to over personalize thing. The other thing I always tell people that as a diplomat, I was what we call a political officer. So my primary responsibility was understanding and conveying political messages. But I told people that it would have been more useful for me to have a degree in psychology than a degree in political science, because understanding personalities and people's kind of perspective and how their own experience affects that is often very useful in understanding how they in their states act.
Thank you so much, as John. As we are nearing the end of this discussion, looking ahead, what advice would you give to both U.S. and Bangladeshi policymakers to ensure a resilient long-term partnership that address economic security and educational dimensions?
Yeah. So again, I write a lot about Bangladesh. I appear on various shows, and I say often very similar things, right? Because my view is evolving, but it's relatively consistent. And one of the issues I've been harping on is that for Bangladesh, too much of the discussion is about the past, and not enough discussion is about the future. So we have to understand the past. We have to understand what happened in the past, but the past alone can't guide our actions in the present. Our actions in the present also have to be informed by the future. And with this in mind, there are many voices in Bangladesh. In fact, there are so many voices. Sometimes the noise, obscures the true reality of what's happening. So you have to be selective in what voices you listen to. I'm very open. Is that the voices I listen to the most these days about Bangladesh are young people. I have children, adult children, who are members of this Gen Z cohort. So I understand Gen Z in a way that many people may not. I understand their strengths, their weaknesses, their hopes, their aspirations. They lack experience, but they have passion. And the future of Bangladesh is going to be determined by its young people, not just in politics. I mean, certainly they'll play a political role, but they'll play an important role in the professions. They'll play an important role in business, in the arts, in diplomacy, in media, in many ways. Um, the young people of Bangladesh own the future, and those are the voices that they should listen to. And I know that older generations hold on. I mean, they hold on in our country. I mean, last presidential election, we had two people, in the very advanced stages of life who were competing to be president to lead our country. I would have loved to have seen younger people coming up at that level. It didn't happen then. I hope it'll happen in the future. But I think for the United States, Bangladesh, and other countries in the world, there are a lot of problems in the world. A lot of these problems are ones that are going to be difficult ones that are going to require cooperation across borders. So my sense is our best hope for addressing those problems and coming up with sustainable solutions will be to listen to younger voices. So I'm very conscious of that in my life, and that would be my advice for people working on U.S. Bangladesh relations: is to not just listen to the old people who always were the ones who had the microphone, but give the floor to young people.
Thank you so much, John, for your time and for your insights on issues related to economy, security, and other aspects affecting the US Bangladesh relationship. As we end this show today, I would like to request the audiences to see the US Bangladesh relationship through a broader lens, going above political lenses, because the bilateral relationships is not only about any specific political entities or political parties. It is about two countries, it is about the people of two countries. And we certainly hope that the US Bangladesh relationship will get more press, more attention than it did before. And in the coming days, both countries will prosper together, partners together in various aspects, and succeed together. With that, thank you for today, and thank you, John.
Great. Thank you very much.